Cooper Kupp, officially according to the Rams, he's going to be available on the trade market. And because of that, immediately, Lions fans are talking about Cooper Kupp, so we might as well address it. Let's get right into it. Cooper Kupp apparently is going to be available on the trade market. Rams are actively shopping Cooper Kupp. He put out a statement that was like, I don't agree with this. I thought I had a fantastic training camp coming into the season. I felt healthy. But it sounds like I'm going to be on the move. And because of that, Lions fans with the connections, this has happened before, by the way. This is not the first time that Cooper Kupp has been tied with the Lions. I think it was a year or two ago that this also happened, where it was like, oh, he could be available. What if we traded for him? Because of the way that his contract aligns. And this is really the first year that there's a clear out for the LA Rams that currently are set to have almost $30 million cap hits the next 2 seasons, the final 2 seasons of Cooper Kupp's deal. So it makes sense that they're looking to move off this contract. But I think he's such an interesting case this past season. Really, over the last 2 years, production-wise, has been very similar, about 700 yards receiving. The production has taken a massive drop-off. In fairness, this past season, though, he did miss a pretty good amount of time between week 2, getting back in week 7, had an ankle injury, missed a lot of time, then came back for the final stretch of the season. They won a lot of games, played in the playoffs as well, and had a really nice game against Philly, 5 receptions, 61 yards. But I think what's so interesting about this case is looking at his production to start off with through this past season was the way that it dropped off as the season went on. When he first got back from his injury, including the first game he played against the Lions where he went for 110 yards, he was pretty darn productive for the LA Rams. His stretch was 110 yards, 37 yards, 51 yards, 109 yards, 80 yards, 106 yards, 60 yards. That was before the Philadelphia game, where seemingly from that point on, everything kind of dropped off for his production offensively. But it does coincide with the numbers that you see from Matthew Stafford during that time as well, in terms of his passing stats. From the Philadelphia game on, his passing numbers look like this: 243 yards, 183 yards, did have a 320-yard passing game within there, 160 yards, 110 yards, 189 yards, 209 yards, which was the first playoff game against Minnesota, and then the 324 in the playoffs, where Cooper Kupp had over 60 of those yards. So his passing stats also took a drop, and I think that what we're seeing from the LA Rams here is it's not just a Cooper Kupp thing, though it is a lot of Cooper Kupp, and it's also the contract situation, maybe wanting to get some draft picks back and go in a little bit of a different direction, because he seemingly has been on a little bit of a decline. He's 31 and a half years old at this point. That's very understandable. But I think it's also about the fact that the LA Rams are going to be changing how they do things offensively. After the season, Sean McVay talked about wanting to have the run game versatility as an offense, and I think for them, that's going to be what they're focused on this offseason. If you remember, they got really hot towards the end of the year, won a lot of games. Their defense started to really ascend. I think they're going to continue to try to lean on that. They want more run game flexibility, so maybe we get more investments on potentially the offensive line, but running back specifically. I think that we're also going to see just kind of a difference in terms of how they want to attack things. Also considering Stafford's age, probably want it to be a little bit more run heavy, be a little bit more explosive through play action, because if you look at the LA Rams this past season, rarely, this doesn't typically happen with the Rams. When it does under Sean McVay, typically things take a major step back. They didn't create many explosives. They were pretty much below average across the board in creating explosive plays down the field. They averaged the 5th most plays per drive last season, and that explosiveness, when we've seen that drop in the past, I mean, you think about with Stafford, that's what they wanted to add, was that element. When that's dropped in the past, you go back to 2020, for example, when the offensive line took a step back, that team as a whole took a major step back offensively. When the offensive line got very banged up, they were well below average at that time. And that's kind of what the LA Rams turned into in some ways this past season. So the adjustment was, not to that extent, the adjustment was going to run the ball more, we're not going to throw the ball as often, and we're going to lean on this defense. And they won a lot of games because of it. And I think that that's going to be the strategy going forward, is they want to be more of an explosive offense that builds around guys like Puka Nacua, because they've always had the same kind of body types when it comes to receiver. But if this is an opportunity for them to just add extra draft capital, get out of the contract now, which has an extremely high cap hit, and kind of jump ahead of that, I think it makes sense why the Rams are looking at it from that perspective, considering that he still can be very productive, but he's productive when they throw the ball a lot. When they don't throw the ball a lot, obviously it's not the same. He's not looked at as a big play action vertical threat, looked at as the most explosive like vertical threat specifically for play action sets. So I think it's just an interesting overview of how this shook out this past season. And again, over the last 2 seasons, production has been on the decline. That being said, though, he still can absolutely play. And when you look at the contract situation, it's going to be very interesting, because he's currently set for the new team that brings in Cooper Kupp to have about a $20 million cap hit over the next 2 seasons for that new team. Now, there's $5 million of that's set to be guaranteed for this upcoming year. That's like March 15th for his roster bonus. And according to reports, the Rams may be willing to drop that down to try to facilitate a trade and make that happen. There's a lot of base money also thrown into his contract, and the expectation is that someone trades for him. Number one, the the Rams probably will have to eat some of that cap space, which could allow them to get more draft capital in return. There's also the aspect that it's very likely that the new team that brings in Kupp is probably going to look at his contract and say, we got to get a completely new contract here. We're not going to be paying you that much money per season based on what your production has been and where your age is at. Spotrac offered the idea of a 2-year, $22 million contract with $10 million guaranteed. You spread in 3 void years, and his cap hit could be as low as just over $3 million. So that would be the expectation. It's not going to be exactly what the deal is now. Kind of like Myles Garrett, in a different way, he's looking for an extension. Kupp, I just expect to be making less for that new team than what his number is going to be currently set at once that trade goes through, and I would expect that the Rams are going to take some of that cap because I think that's their leverage right now. Is they have an out, they need to kind of get out of that, but at the same time, for a team to take him on, they're also going to have to eat some of that guaranteed money. 31-year-old receiver, there is still a lot of talent, and just going back and watching, there was still a lot of things that he brings to the table. You hear it, oh, he's washed, he can't play, he only can play slot. There's all of these things, and like I've addressed this before. Last time this came up as an option, I think it was 2 years ago, and I was like, I think this could work with St. Brown, it could work within the offense. I think the idea is like, we think about it too vanilla as like, oh wow, there's 3 receivers, most teams play that offensively now, even though the Lions will dabble in some other things, much more 12 personnel that's constantly ramped up for the Lions. They played their most 12 personnel this past season, or 12 personnel, or mainly just having 2 receivers on the field. They leaned into that very heavily. That's steadily kind of risen for the Lions. But there's also the aspect of, the main thing about Cooper Kupp is, yes, he can align wide. He also can play on the line of scrimmage. We know that vertically, he's not the deep threat. He's not the guy that has that kind of vertical speed. He's also not the biggest body or the most explosive leaper at the catch point. But what he's always been is excellent body control, really good pacing, fantastic footwork, incredibly reliable hands with a lot of reactive athleticism to make grabs, scoop passes off the turf. He's always been that piece, and I think he still is that guy. But there's areas that I think have taken steps back that have limited some of that recently for Cooper Kupp, but the idea that he can only align in the slot, again, that idea of only playing in the slot, one, it's not true because he has aligned wide, but the idea of lining in the slot doesn't mean that you have to be inside of another receiver. You can be the widest receiver on a play, but still be in a slot alignment just based on how far you are off from the end of the line of scrimmage or end of the offensive tackle, and that's what he does with a lot of condensed and tight splits. Rams do that a lot. Lions will do it as well. You'll get those stacks, you'll get the bunches, and then also you have the aspect of, can he be the point man? Probably not as likely you'd want in there, but his footwork off the line as well as some pretty nice hand usage, it does allow him to separate right off the ball. Definitely has a skill set to get off the ball. He has great footwork, so his release package is able to kind of lean into that. So if a guy tries to press man, which isn't typically what teams do anyway, but in situations that he actually found success, especially if you look back against us, he had a lot of success. Another reason is he doesn't typically align on the ball is because he's a movement piece. He had more motion last season than anybody while missing the amount of games that he did. He motions a ton. They use him on the move all the time. So there's that aspect as well. So not your typical 6'5" big body receiver that you're thinking of like, oh, he's got the vertical speed, he's kind of the go up and get it kind of guy. He's not that, but he can align at different spots. So he can make it work even if you have a slot receiver that you already like. And let's keep in mind, let's not limit St. Brown to a slot receiver. He plays everywhere as well. So stylistically, yes, you could make this work. There's no doubt, especially in the way the NFL is played today with so much zone coverage, he can still beat up zone coverage. But I think there are areas in which his game has seemingly taken a step back. Number one, he's never been the deep drag or crosser or vertical threat. So his 4.6 speed that he came out with is always been that, but you also saw this past season a lot of times where he was just kind of used as a decoy, ran beneath routes, settled down underneath the line of scrimmage, wasn't even utilized in those spots to try to get open, try to run away from coverage. That's not how he was utilized. One of the areas where I had the biggest takeaways was the run after catch. Really, after our Rams games that I went back and watched the first week of the season, didn't feel like there was much run after catch at all. There was no production after the catch, and while he was still utilized on screens, truly felt like a possession receiver this past year. And when you talk about wanting explosive plays, there's multiple ways to do it, but one thing for Kupp is usually he's great after the catch. In this season, I just didn't see as much of that consistently, and I think that's truly an area where you feel like, okay, it's taking a little bit of a step back within his game because there were many opportunities where he just seemingly left that completely on the field. But he does really well that if he was, for example, a Lion, is that he attacks off coverage really well. That footwork comes into play. We saw it against the Lions week 1, but we've seen that many other times. Teams that are playing quarters coverage, teams that are playing off-man coverage. That ability at the top of the route to separate, to me, would be better than, say, a guy like Tim Patrick from this past season because he's better in those areas in terms of creating that separation, the route discipline in that vertical push, the fluidity in and out of his cuts, the limited footwork that allows him to create separation on deep out routes, and then of course the body control towards the sideline. Those things he still brings, and again, the catch radius is really good for down and away passes. He has a great scoop technique, so he typically finishes in those spots. Still plays with high football intelligence. He runs stacks and runs rub routes incredibly well to get himself open, and as mentioned, he has fantastic press footwork, so level 1 separation against man coverage coverage is still absolutely a part of his game. Where I think things started to feel a little more limited was level 2 separation, specifically against man coverage. Number one, he's not a guy that typically walls player off at the second level. That's not his game. He's not the most explosive at the catch point either, so you don't get a lot of like throw it up and let him go get it. He's not that piece either. And I think we saw this past season a lot of the level 2 routes, intermediate routes between 10 and 19 yards that was against man coverage. There just wasn't as much separation. The amount of times that guys could get physical with him and kind of just take away the route completely showed up way too often. I thought the lack of explosiveness as a route runner and suddenness really showed up. I mean, he's always had that agility, but even through contact, just the ability to separate with an explosion out of his cuts and burst out of his cuts just felt very lacking. Everything felt kind of back to one pace. Unfortunately, there just wasn't that kind of dynamic athleticism in and out of breaks. And you actually have to go back really to 2022 for the last time that he was really productive in the intermediate and deep levels of the field. It's been very much short pass reliant. And I think that against zone, it opens up a lot more because guys aren't right up on him. But we saw this past season against man, that seemingly took a massive step back this past year. Felt much more like a level 1 route runner. Production-wise, he's still really good within his own role. Obviously, his movement tease, his football intelligence, his catching ability. He only dropped 2 passes this past season, had a 111 pass rating when targeted. But there is some limitations, as we've always known, but I think that it shows up even a little bit more this past season. His inability at times to separate at level 2 routes against man coverage felt very kind of simplified to, if it's level 1, he can get open. Outside of that, it's not a ton. And then he's not adding much of an explosive element vertically already, but now on top of that, he's not doing much after the catch. So unless it's like a deep in-breaking route that he runs really well with good size, but not fantastic, and again, he's not a great leaper, so he still has to be relatively open, he'll catch a lot of those passes, and he runs them about as well as you can. Again, better than a guy like Tim Patrick would have last season, so he can be beneficial there, but it just has seemed that there's a lot of areas of his game which are just less impactful at this point, and you're getting a little bit more straightforward, I know what I'm getting here with Cooper Kupp. That being said, though, is he still valuable? I think absolutely. I think he's valuable for a lot of teams. Should he be your number 1? Probably not. But is he valuable? Yes, he's valuable. If you have a good receiving core and he popped him in there, he'd be great. Would he be successful with the Lions? I believe so. That there's certain ways, like the top of the routes, like against off coverage, that he'd be better than what we had, especially at his size this past season. Now, Jamo's got a lot better in that area, so I'm not saying better than Jamo, but as like the number 3 receiver, he'd be a lot better, and his flexibility allows him to line pretty much everywhere. But there's also spots where you just probably wouldn't get much production going forward, and I think the limitations after the catch is the big concern for me specifically. So I think for the Lions side of things, unless his contract was significantly dropped off of the move, I really don't see why the Lions would make this move happen. But if you told me that it was, hey, he took a really big reduce in what you actually have to pay him, the Rams end up eating a lot of that, bonus that he's guaranteed. At that point, if it costs like a 6th round pick, could potentially they consider a day 3 pick swap for Cooper Kupp? I think at that point, it could be on the table. But I think anything more than that would surprise me. And if his contract didn't significantly drop, I really don't see the Lions doing this. Positive is, in terms of who we're paying at receiver, you can align it where it's before the Hutch extension, it's before the JMO extension, it's before a lot of those deals specifically, because they have their 5th-year options. So they're under contract this year, and next year they'd have their 5th-year options. You can fold that into a new deal, keep those cap hits low, and you could overlap that. The timing could match up for the last 2 years of his contract. The way I see it, if it's anything in double digits million per year, I just don't think there's any possible way that this could go down. It would have to be, to me, single digits in terms of the cap number, a low single digit number very likely, and then because of the long-term aspect, I don't think year 2 would be able to be guaranteed whatsoever because of the fact of you don't have a lot of cap space ever next season because you got a lot of guys under contract, and you may have to make some real decisions there, and then extensions start to again come back into play. I just don't see the path. It'd be like a 1-year rental. It'd have to be very cheap, and the pick swap would have to be real in the 3rd round. I can't touch a day 2 pick for something like that. I do think that would have to be a significant drop. So I don't think he should be like, oh, this guy can't play anymore. He absolutely can play. It's just a more specific role now. And I think at that point, there's things that have to really shake out. You can't have a $15 to $20 million cap hit for Cooper Kupp over the next 2 years. I think that's insane. And you can't give up a day 2 pick for Cooper Kupp. I think that would be crazy. How this will probably go, I would expect that they're not going to make the move. But I just want to touch on this. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, Prop, for watching, and I'm out.